So I thought I'd start by again introducing you to Primafuel if you haven't been following us already. First, actually, I'd like to point out our slogan, leading the way to zero carbon fuels. It's not just a slogan. I realize, as much as all of you realize, that there's no such thing as zero carbon fuels just yet, but we better try to get there or we have other really big problems. Now, it's, like I said, not just a slogan. Our founding management team comes from decades of commitment to life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for the transportation sector. Everything from the world's first commercialized fuel cell system out there, the PC-25, which some of you know about on distributed power generation, all the way through to things that just happened last month. The world's first fuel cell powered manned aircraft flew. And that's something that our management team had a part of developing over the last several years. So again, a long-standing commitment to life cycle greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Now then, along the way, our founding team obviously was preoccupied in a sense with this issue of life cycle assessment and life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And after spending several years in the hydrogen industry, we took a very long and hard look at fuels of the future and what really needs to happen to get us on a pathway to sustainability. And all of this comes back to how do we get to this objective of zero carbon fuels? And the answer is twofold: technology and infrastructure. And they are both commingled challenges that amount to the solution. You can't do one without the other. And a lot of folks enjoy talking about technology, and I'm guilty as the next guy as a technologist. I love talking about bleeding edge technology, but there's the other side of the equation, getting these new fuels to market. This is not a trivial challenge. Everything from the pump and the nozzle that you know of that you stick into your car, just upstream, the terminaling infrastructure, that last second to last mile that we're so short on in California, these are all parts of the solution, and Primafuel is involved in both of these sectors. Needless to say, the low carbon fuels industry wouldn't exist without very, very clear regulatory guidance from governments. California is certainly no slouch when it comes to environmental regulations, and now the low carbon fuel standard is a really exciting and very progressive element of what could be a national program towards low carbon fuels. So we're very busy here in Sacramento. We're busy in Washington, D.C., working on things like the Warner-Lieberman bill and the Alexander Amendment, which carries with it some elements of the low carbon fuel standard at the federal level. We've also had the great privilege of doing some work with the United Nations. We had the honor of participating in the Bali conference in December with the UNFCCC, discussing things like sustainability with respect to biofuels and other aspects, other new emerging challenges to the biofuels industry. And we also have the opportunity to do some exciting work in China. In fact, during this morning's presentations, you heard about the state's participation in a Chinese low carbon fuel standard meeting later this week. In fact, Primafuel will be participating. In fact, my CEO, Richard Woods, standing here, is off to China, I think today or day after tomorrow or something, to participate precisely in that forum. So we are very involved on the policy side, and like I said, without understanding and guiding the policy, there is no low carbon fuels industry. So it behooves us all to really understand what's happening at the regulatory level to understand whether certain commercial strategies are viable or not. So, having said that, infrastructure and technology. In most companies, these two things they're not both happening. Usually you got one company that's involved in infrastructure and one that's involved in technology. Now, looking at the challenge that the low carbon fuel standard and the new ESA program, the RFS2 coming out of Washington last December, pose a challenge that is very complex and involves both of these things. And I'd direct your attention to this chart over here, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with what's on this chart, but effectively what we see is an incredible ramp up in the supply of what are prescriptive biofuels over the past 15 years, and over the next 15 years, a ramp up of low carbon fuels. And I can say that with great pride, actually, because finally our biofuels industry is making a transition into a low carbon fuels industry with the new RFS2, which we learned this morning from the EPA requires a minimum of 20% life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from conventional biofuels, 50% from advanced biofuels, including biodiesel, and 60% from cellulosic fuels. Now, if we assume that indeed the nation meets all of those volumetric requirements, we can see that we're getting to 36 billion gallons of fuel just after 2020. 2022 is in fact the deadline. That volumetric challenge is an infrastructure challenge. Getting those fuels produced, getting them to market, and very importantly at Primafuel, tracking the life cycle impacts of those fuels is mission critical. That, again, is an infrastructure challenge. Now, getting those fuels lower and lower and lower carbon over time, that is a technology challenge. And unless you understand the technology issues, it's very difficult to figure out where you should be investing in infrastructure. And unless you understand the infrastructure pinch points, it's very difficult to guide your technology. And that is why Primafuel, quite uniquely in this space, is involved with both. So quickly on infrastructure. I mentioned three main functions that Primafuel is involved with: fuel production, storage and distribution infrastructure, and very importantly, life cycle greenhouse gas tracking. A big question that folks have about biofuels and everything else is how in God's name are we going to know whether fuel A is better than fuel B? Well, it starts with the infrastructure in truth, because today's infrastructure is unable to distinguish between fuel A and fuel B, and really what you get at the end of the day is a fungible product that may have come from who knows where and produced from who knows what. That is a very serious challenge that Primafuel is taking to task. What does infrastructure really mean? Primafuel is investing hundreds of millions of dollars in new infrastructure, and that means pipelines, bulk terminals, marine infrastructure, and rail. Why? Remember that 36 billion gallon number. That fuel doesn't just suddenly materialize into your gas tank. It needs to get there. And in California, we have a particular problem. We have a rail shortage, we have a pipeline shortage, we have a bulk liquids terminal shortage, and a marine infrastructure shortage. And in fact, it's getting worse, not better. Now, it's a lot smarter for us to invest now than wait for 20 years until it's frankly too late to invest and try to do it then. And that is why Primafuel is so heavily involved in this side of the business. There are some important policy implications. Like I said, there is a shortage of infrastructure now. The Low Carbon Fuels Standard and RFS2 only multiply those shortages and make the impact that much more real in terms of meeting our climate change objectives. So that's why, from a policy perspective, it's really important for legislators and regulators to understand that infrastructure is absolutely part of the solution. CEC has been issuing warnings about these shortages for years. It's time we start to listen and invest. CARB needs to listen to CEC, and all those things need to start happening. Otherwise, we have a more permanent problem. The fact is that investment decisions are happening today, and they will seriously impact the ability of the state of California to meet its objectives under the Low Carbon Fuel Standard or not. And from that vantage point, it is very critical that our legislators and regulators understand the issues.